So in her workshop, Rebecca Letterman here, I was not there, I heard this secondhand, but she was talking about the body and how we connect to God, and said that when we sing together in worship, I thought this was fascinating. When we come together and sing in worship, our breath gets aligned and then our heartbeats align. You should be saying, ooh, because that's deep. Isn't that cool? That's a part of how we unite together as the body of Christ. I think that's really cool. So y'all are aligned in that sense. I'm not going to bury the lead. I'm just going to let you guys know. Today's my birthday. Can you believe I waited till this late in the day to let you know that? So I'm 39. Spontaneous. Clever people. Yeah, that's weird. So, yeah, actually not 39, 63. But you know, they say 60 is the new 40. So I thought I'd try it out. But I still got a speeding ticket. No? No? These jokes are having trouble. I'm going to have to go back to Becky giving me better jokes. Well, and people do say, I've been accused of a lot of things, you know, which is great. A heretic, all kinds of stuff. But some people say, you hold this conference every year at the last week of September because it's your birthday. Probably at a subconscious level, that's true. But on a conscious level, the reason we do it is because the last weekend in September is the absolute best week of weather we get in Wichita. And one of my favorite things is that people come to this conference from outside of Kansas, which is like 75% of you, and you come to me and say, the weather's so beautiful here. And I say, it is this week. See you in 2 weeks, it's gonna be really cold. And it was really hot 2 weeks ago. One of the things I try to do is invite people to this stage who have great names. Ken Shigematsu, Heather Thompson-Day, Brian Zond will be here tomorrow, Emily P. Freeman. And our next speaker maybe has the coolest of all the names, Skye Jethani. Sounds like a spy, like James Bond character. If I write a novel, I think I want to name my main character Skye Jethani. Because my name is Jim Smith. It's no good. Skye will come and speak to us. After he's done, we'll do a Q&A, and then the Singing Quakers are coming. So as we said, don't leave. They're going to come surround us. Our next speaker is, like all of these guests, an award-winning, best-selling author, co-host of the Holy Post podcast. How many listen to the Holy Post? A bunch of you. This is an excellent podcast. He's written a dozen books. He's worked with Christianity Today. He's been on his resume is incredibly impressive. New York Times, USA Today, Washington Post. He's spoken at the Chautauqua Institute, the Lausanne Conference, and today, he gets to say he will have spoken at the Apprentice Gathering. So let's welcome to the stage, Skye Jethani.
Thank you. We're here to talk about spiritual growth, spiritual formation. All growth happens with 3 words. I don't know. Let me begin by illustrating that with a story from my daughter, Zoe. She's now 23. When she was 16, the day before she turned 16, before she got her driver's license, she and I were driving together. I pulled into the gas station and had to fill up my tank, And it occurred to me, she's getting her license tomorrow. She needs to know how to fill up the tank. So I lean back into the car. I say, hey, honey, do you want to come out here? I'll show you how to fill up the gas tank. She's pecking away on her phone. Dad, I know how to fill up the tank. I'm like, when did you learn how to fill the tank? And she said, Mom showed me how to fill the tank. And she's just pecking away. I was like, all right. You know, as a parent, a lot of parenting is just knowing which battles to fight and which ones to let go. And I just, okay, I'm going to let that one go. I had a little check in my spirit, but whatever. So I filled up the tank. We went on with our day. The next day, her birthday, she goes in. She passes her driving test. The driving test guy said she's the best teenager driver I've ever seen. I'm like, thank you very much. Yeah, like, I've done something good. She gets her license, takes the car out, and that night, around 11 o'clock at night, I get a call. And she said, Dad, I'm at so-and-so's house. The car won't start. And I'm thinking, rookie mistake. You know, she probably left the headlights on and drained the battery or didn't put it in park. So I'm going through all the obvious problems it could be. And finally I said to her, well, do you have gas? And she's like, yeah, I filled it up today. And then we start going deeper into the conversation, and I said, did you do this? She said, yeah, I did that. And then I said, well, what did you put in it? And she said, you told me just to put the cheapest stuff in it. I said, you didn't put diesel in it, did you? She's like, yeah, I put diesel in it. Oh, that's my reaction. Now, this was a 15-year-old Honda, but it still was like, oh. And I'm like, wait a minute, the diesel nozzle won't even fit into the tank. How did you do that? And she goes, I don't know. I'm like, now you don't know? The problem was this happened, one of her close friends happened to be the principal's daughter. She was at the principal's house where this happened. The rest of her high school career, her nickname was Diesel. Had my daughter had the humility the day before to simply say, I don't know, it would have spared her 2 years of teasing and me $700 to get the car repaired. Growth begins by saying, I don't know. And I think this is an obstacle to us, especially in the American church right now, for reasons that I'll get into in a little bit. But I really want to begin in Philadelphia on June 10th, 1752. A few weeks before that, Benjamin Franklin had been experimenting with electricity in his home. He'd been taking metal spheres and wool and creating electric charge and making little sparks fly between the spheres. And as he looked closely at them, he realized that those little bolts of static electricity kind of looked like lightning. And he began to hypothesize whether or not lightning could just be static electricity in the atmosphere. And so on that day, a storm was coming towards Philadelphia, and he brought out a silk kite, and he tied a key to the hemp thread. And sure enough, as the storm got closer and closer, he noticed that sparks started flying off the key as the rain hit it, proving that there was an electrical charge in the atmosphere. Because of Benjamin Franklin's experimentation with electricity and the key that day, and we all know that story, he ended up developing one of the most important inventions of the 18th century, the lightning rod. It's probably not occurred to you, but throughout most of history, churches burned down more than any other structures, because churches were typically the tallest structure in any building, and lightning would frequently strike churches, sparking fires. But Franklin figured out if you put a rod on the top of the church building, you could safely conduct the electrical charge around the building into the ground. So after 1752, he started spreading this invention, and structures all over the colonies and then Europe started putting lightning rods on top of churches. But there was just one problem. You see, a lot of Christians didn't trust Benjamin Franklin, and they didn't trust his scientific method. A lot of Christians in the 18th century were certain that they already understood what lightning was and how it worked. In their minds, lightning was not an electric charge in the atmosphere, or not merely an electric charge in the atmosphere. They believed that lightning came from the finger of God, and it was his judgment upon sinners. And so controversy started to spread throughout the American colonies and in Europe about whether or not it was appropriate to put a lightning rod on top of a church. Congregations were divided. People rioted in the streets when lightning rods went up in their town. People sued their congregations and their church leaders for putting lightning rods on top of churches, believing that this would provoke God's anger and wrath because it was man's attempt to circumnavigate the judgment of God. If you thought masks or vaccines or any of that stuff caused controversy in the church, the original lightning rod issue in the church was lightning rods. But I want you to notice Franklin's ability to understand lightning began by his admission that he didn't understand lightning. And so many other people who refused to protect themselves and their churches, their refusal came from their certainty that they already understood what was going on. I know a lot of us here are indebted to and fans of the work of Dallas Willard. I certainly am. He wrote frequently about a model of transformation that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. He called it VIM, Vision, Intention, and Means. And he talked often about how this is how people change. It begins when they get a vision of a different kind of life. And they're drawn to that vision, and then they make a choice to make that vision true of themselves. And only after the V and the I does the M come into play, the means. How then do I change? Long time ago, when I was a local pastor and I discovered Dallas's writings and I read about this model, it was like the lights going on for me. Because I realized that almost all of my energy and time and effort as a pastor was going into the M, giving people the means to grow spiritually, giving them the structures, the Bible studies, the small groups, the different outlets and classes, all that. I was pouring all my energy into the means, and I was struggling to figure out why weren't people changing. And Dallas's language helped me understand, it's because they don't want to change, and it's because they haven't really been given a ravishing vision of what a life with Jesus would look like for them, so the means go unengaged. And that transformed me as a pastor, and my focus became much more on vision, helping people catch a glimpse of what their life with Christ could be. Okay, now here comes the confession part. For the last 10 years or so, I don't think it's been working anymore. And this is not an indictment of Dallas's intelligence or model. I don't think it's wrong. But I've realized more and more as I get around the country, as I speak a lot, as I engage different Christian communities of different forms, the vision thing isn't working. And if you don't get the vision piece, the intention and the means, well, forget about it. And I've been racking my brain trying to figure out why isn't the vision getting through? And I'm increasingly convinced, I'm kind of workshopping this a little bit with you guys, and you can talk to me later if you think I'm onto something, but I think there's another piece that actually comes before the vision. And if we don't deal with this, the rest doesn't work. And what has to be present before you can receive the vision is humble curiosity. And I'm worried this is what we've lost in a lot of the American church. We are simply uncurious. We think we already have it all figured out. We have a sinful sense of certainty. And if I'm already certain I'm right, then I won't receive the vision, I'm not going to choose it, and the means, that is way down the road. So many places I go around this country, or so many people I interact with, they are closed to any other way of thinking about their life because they are certain they've already got it figured out. And that certainty is really, really appealing, especially as our culture becomes more diverse, more contentious. I want to take you to a text in the Gospel of John that illustrates these two dynamics, this humble curiosity and this sinful certainty. It's John chapter 9. We're not going to walk through the whole text. It's an amazing story, but I want to highlight some pieces of it. The story begins when Jesus and his disciples encounter a man who was born blind. And the disciples say to Jesus, "Who sinned that this man was born blind, him or his parents?" See, in that culture, in that time, it was just assumed if you had some kind of ailment, problem, if you were poor, if you were sick, if you were blind, it was God's judgment on you. It's kind of like the lightning, right? It's God's judgment. And they just simply needed to know, well, who's being judged? Is it him or his parents? They were certain they knew why somebody was born blind. And Jesus says, no, it has nothing to do with sin. He was born this way that the glory of God might be revealed in him, and then Jesus heals the man of his blindness. But that's just the beginning of the story, because what unfolds for the rest of the chapter is this fascinating dialogue between the healed man and the religious leaders in his town. And by the time you get to the end of the chapter, the blind man who had been healed, who was clearly uneducated because he had been born blind, he was considered a sinner because he had been born blind. He was at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. At the end of the story, he is the one who confesses belief in Jesus. And it's the religious authorities, the most educated, intelligent men in the community who practiced all the spiritual disciplines, who engaged in Scripture and knew it backwards and forwards. It was the religious leaders who end up rejecting Jesus at the end of the story. So the question is, why? Why did the ignorant man come to follow Jesus while the educated ones rejected him? That's what I want to look at today. And to begin to explain it, we need to go to Oak Park, Illinois, 1954. It's actually just down the road from where I live. In Oak Park in 1954 lived a woman named Dorothy Martin. She was nuts. I mean that in the technical theological sense. She was a cult leader. Dorothy Martin had built a cult, and she told her cult members that the world was going to end with a cataclysmic flood on January 21st, 1954. But she told them if they sold all their property and if they obeyed all of her commands, that a UFO would come and rescue them off the earth before the world was destroyed. I don't need to tell you, the world did not end in a cataclysmic flood on December 21st, 1954. But that caught the attention of a researcher at Stanford named Leon Festinger. Festinger wanted to figure out how did these cult members deal with the fact that they'd been duped, that they'd been lied to or deceived by Dorothy Martin. So he started interviewing all these cult members. They were part of a cult called the Seekers. And as Festinger did his research, he was pretty shocked at what he uncovered. What he found was that very, very few of the cult members were willing to admit that they had been deceived or lied to by Dorothy Martin. Only a tiny fraction of them. The majority of them were still committed to her and to the cult despite no cataclysmic flood. Instead, what Festinger was told by many of these cult members was that it was because they had obeyed Dorothy Martin and sold their property and their businesses and all that, that they were the reason the flood didn't happen. That their obedience had postponed the end of the world. Festinger ended up coining the term cognitive dissonance. You've heard that before? Cognitive dissonance refers to what happens in our minds when we encounter evidence or facts that fundamentally disagree with a strongly held belief. So these cult members strongly believed the world was going to end, and then they encounter the fact that the world did not end. Cognitive dissonance, noise in the brain. And Festinger said, most human beings simply cannot live for any extended amount of time in this state of cognitive dissonance. We have to find some way of resolving the disagreement between our belief and the evidence. And we will go to extraordinary lengths to reconcile those two things, to get rid of the cognitive dissonance. But the one thing most people will not do is question their strongly held belief. And that's what you see in these cult members. They couldn't admit that Dorothy Martin had lied. They couldn't admit that they were wrong. They couldn't admit that they were part of a cult that had misled them. So they had to figure out a way to get rid of the dissonance. And their way of getting rid of it was to reconcile the fact that the world hadn't ended by saying it was because of their obedience. This is what cognitive dissonance does. And it's something you see again and again and again. Let's go back to the lightning rods. Benjamin Franklin invents this thing. It starts spreading all over the colonies and then across the pond to Europe, and it's causing division. Churches are fighting, communities are fighting, like I said, lawsuits, rioting in the streets. People are really upset. But the anti-lightning rod people eventually faced a moment of cognitive dissonance. Remember, they believe that lightning is God's judgment upon humans. And a lightning rod, therefore, is interfering with God's judgment. And somebody pointed out the fact that, well, okay, if lightning is God's judgment, why is it always striking churches and not the brothels and the bars? Uh-oh, cognitive dissonance. Well, I don't know, on the 18th century equivalent of Facebook, somebody came up with a way of solving this cognitive dissonance. And they said, okay, yeah, fine. The reason is because lightning is God's judgment, but it's his passive judgment. He actually outsources the execution of this judgment to demons, kind of like in the story of Job. And sometimes these demons, they don't get it right. They go off the plan, they do their mischief, and so they go after churches instead of actual sinners. And then it gets more elaborate. They decide, well, these thunder demons that arrive with the storms and are striking down churches, the best way to ward off thunder demons is by ringing church bells. You start to see the problem? All throughout the colonies and in Europe is spreading this view that the best way to protect your church from a lightning strike and a thunderstorm is to send a guy up into the steeple to hang on a wet rope attached to a giant metal bell. We can laugh because it's been a couple centuries. But the outcome was actually horrible. Literally hundreds of people died ringing church bells during thunderstorms to ward off the thunder demons. In Germany, in the years immediately after the lightning rod was invented, over 100 people were killed ringing church bells. In France, between 1757 and 1786, 103 bell ringers were electrocuted until the Parliament in Paris outlawed ringing bells during storms. Here's my point. Certainty makes us stupid. Certainty makes us stupid. In John 9, after this man was healed of his blindness, people were shocked. They'd never seen a miracle like this, but there's not a single miracle in the Old Testament of someone being healed of blindness, certainly not anybody born blind. So it sent shockwaves through the community. What does this mean? And so they started talking and asking questions. They didn't know how to answer it. So what did they do? They bring the healed man before the religious leaders, the smartest, most educated guys in town. And they ask, what does this mean? Verse 13, they brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man, meaning Jesus, is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. They were certain that they understood how Sabbath worked, that they knew how God worked, that their interpretation of the Old Testament was right, and they say definitively Jesus cannot be from God. Verse 16, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, here's the cognitive dissonance, how can a sinner perform such signs? All right, fine. You say a sinner is the only one who would be working on the Sabbath, and yet how can a sinner heal someone who's born blind? Cognitive dissonance. The Pharisees are having their certainty challenged. Leon Festinger, as he studied these cult members and their cognitive dissonance, discovered that there are generally three ways that we deal with evidence that contradicts a strongly held belief. And interestingly, you see exactly these three things in John chapter 9, in the way the Pharisees deal with their cognitive dissonance. The first way we deal with it is to simply deny the evidence. Look at verse 18. It says, they did not believe that the man had been blind. It's a hoax. Fake news. Don't have to believe it. It's garbage. It's just not real. It's put your head in the sand. When you encounter a fact you don't like because it contradicts a strongly held belief, you just go, it's fake news. Garbage, junk, don't worry about it, move on. Well, they tried to do that. The problem is, then they brought the man's parents to the leaders. And the parents, who want to kind of stay out of the whole mess, they actually confirm, no, that's our son, and yes, he was born blind. Now he can see, all right? So the leaders try the second tactic. When the facts cannot be denied, your second option is to discredit the messenger. They attack the blind man. Look at verse 31. The blind man is speaking. He says, we know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, meaning Jesus, if Jesus were not from God, he could do nothing. To this, they, the religious leaders, replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? You see what they're doing? They know he's right. And they can't disagree with the facts presented. He was born blind, now he can see, and Jesus healed him, and it happened on the Sabbath. They can't deny any of that. So what do? They discredit the messenger. You were a sinner from birth. Why should we listen to you? We see this all the time in our culture, don't we? We encounter facts we don't like, and rather than actually dealing with the evidence or dealing with the facts, we want to maintain our certainty, so we discredit the source. Well, that came from Fox News. That came from the New York Times. That came from a progressive. That came from a conservative. That came from a Trump supporter. That came from a Democrat. Whatever your issue is, you discredit the source rather than the evidence itself. It's a defensive way of protecting our certainty. Finally, third, when we can't deny the evidence and we can't discredit the source sufficiently enough, there's one last option available to us: distance. Deny, discredit, distance. Look at verse 34. It says they cast the blind man out. It's actually a technical word. It means they excommunicated him from the synagogue. They couldn't disagree with the evidence. They couldn't discredit it enough, so what did they do? They kicked him out and tried to tell everyone else in the community to stay away from that guy. Why? Because he's a carrier of cognitive dissonance. He's going to make you question our certainty. So just stay as far away from him as possible. Interestingly, this sounds kind of cruel and mean. We may not do this directly to people anymore, but we don't have to. Because we now have algorithms that keep us distant from any cognitive dissonance. It's fascinating. When you study the tech industry and social media and what's evolved over the last 15 years or so, they've discovered that the human brain hates cognitive dissonance. When we encounter it on a website, for example, we will move to a different website. We want to get away from it. Well, how do they keep us hooked on the website? Build an algorithm that guarantees the user will not encounter anything they don't want to see. They will never encounter an idea that contradicts their strongly held belief. You're not going to encounter a person or a voice that you don't agree with. The algorithm learns what you like, learns what you are certain about, and keeps feeding you more and more of what you want. And it makes you dumber and stupider and more certain in your stupidity. So how does all this relate to us as followers of Jesus in the church in the 21st century? One of the reasons why I believe certainty is growing in its appeal is because we do live in the most diverse, divergent country that has ever existed in the history of the world. There are more beliefs, viewpoints, ethnicities, religions, sexual orientations, genders, all of that. I mean, it is just a crazy, messy, complicated world in the 21st century that we occupy, and we are constantly bumping into carriers of cognitive dissonance. People who don't think like us, vote like us, live like us, look like us, worship like us, and it's kind of anxiety-inducing. And in that, it's so attractive when someone says, I've got the answers. I can make you certain. And we flock to those voices online. We flock to those voices on social media. We flock to those voices on cable news. And yes, we flock to those leaders in the church because they make us feel safe. They help us avoid those carriers of cognitive dissonance. But here's the problem. What happens when the carriers of cognitive dissonance can't be avoided? Heather was talking about her passion for Gen Z and millennials. I'm a Gen Xer. My children are Gen Z. And the data, you've probably seen a lot of this as well, but it's not good. According to the Pine Tops Foundation, if we continue on present trends in the next 20 years, 40 million young people who were raised within the church will walk away. 40 million. Forget about reaching people for the gospel. We're not keeping the ones we've got. Why? Young people today are growing up, like I said, in this incredibly complicated, diverse culture. And as we would expect, it fills them with all kinds of questions. And when they reach a certain age, those questions start leaking out of them. And if they're a young person in a church community, those questions are going to leak out in their youth group, or with their parents, or with their parents' friends, or with other families, or with their pastors and leaders. And those questions provoke cognitive dissonance. And if what we really want is certainty all the time, if we want to discredit and deny and distance ourselves so that we can live in this little cocoon, a bubble of certainty, but our own children are the carriers of dissonance, sorry, they got to go. They got to go. Now, we may not actually say that. We may not, kick them out of the church, but that's the message they hear. Your question is not welcomed here. Just be quiet. We'll tell you what to think. That friend of yours that doesn't fit our expectations, no, they're not welcomed here either. That issue you're wrestling with, go talk about it at a coffee shop somewhere, but don't bring it. We're going to pretend that doesn't happen. We've created these homogenous communities that make us feel safe, but they make everyone else feel unwelcomed. And we wonder why people don't catch the vision of life with God and then choose it and then engage in all the wonderful means we've created for them to grow in Christ. Because there is this sinful certainty at the front end, this invisible force that's blocking the rest of the transformation process. This is what keeps me up at night. This is what my great concern is for the church, that in our fear of a rapidly changing culture, we've grasped onto the sin of certainty to make ourselves feel safe. And in the process, we have abandoned our calling in Christ to be hospitable and welcoming to those who are most vulnerable. Let's go to Italy, August 18th, 1769. A town called Brescia. Huge, beautiful cathedral. Brescia had also heard about lightning rods and the controversy stirred there, but they decided to opt in for the thunder demon viewpoint. No lightning rods for us, thank you very much. In fact, they were so certain that they were safe from lightning in their church that they decided to use the vaults of the church as the town depository for its armaments, including 200,000 pounds of gunpowder. You know where this is going. Sure enough, that day a storm runs through the town, lightning strikes the church, starts a fire that eventually ignites the gunpowder. The town was obliterated. An estimated 3,000 people were killed when the cathedral exploded. Not only can certainty make us stupid, it can do incredible damage. We, the followers of Jesus in the United States in 2024, simply need to learn 3 words. I don't know. Our willingness to admit there are times when we don't know the answer. Or even if we think we know. Maybe it's just saying that. I think I know, but I'm not certain. The ability to admit we don't have it all figured out opens us to a posture of learning, of growth, of transformation. And it also opens us to the reality that maybe God has something to say to us through that person that we think is the least likely person He's going to use. I had a friend in ministry some years ago who used to say, you know, Skye, in the Old Testament, it was considered a miracle when God spoke through an ass. But now He does it every Sunday. Thank you very much. He can use anyone, but if we're closed in our mindset, we won't be open to it. Here's what's remarkable. In John chapter 9, the blind man who was healed on more than one occasion says those words. I don't know. Both in verse 12 and in verse 25, he simply replies, I don't know. When he's questioned about Jesus and how He did this, he says, I don't know. Is He from God? I don't know. He says it again and again and again. I don't know. Let me give you 3 simple things that help us not fall into the trap of the sin of certainty. The first I've already mentioned. Making it a discipline to say, I don't know. To not be so prideful that we can't admit it. Here's the second one. The second thing we need to do is we need to distinguish between God and our ideas about God. The problem with the Pharisees in this story, technically speaking, wasn't their certainty exactly. It's what they were certain about. They were certain about their interpretation of the Torah, of Sabbath laws and regulations. They were certain that nobody could heal anybody and truly be from God. They had certainty in their interpretation. But we know, as the followers of Jesus, that truth at its core is not a doctrine. It is a person. The blind man, interestingly, also expresses certainty, but it's not in his ideas. It's in his experience. Verse 25, he says, whether Jesus is a sinner, I do not know. There's the humility. One thing I do know, here comes his certainty. Though I was blind, now I see. His certainty was in his experience with Jesus. We need to remember that our faith is rooted in our life with Jesus, not the doctrines we believe about him. I'm not saying doctrine doesn't matter or Scripture doesn't matter. It does, to the degree to which it illuminates for us who Jesus is and our communion with him. But when we put those doctrines ahead of love, as Paul says, we are nothing. Finally, third, to break the illusion of certainty, we must remain engaged in community. And particularly, community we do not choose. Community we choose is easy because it's people just like us, birds of a feather and all that. The church is not to be a community you choose. It's the community Jesus is called to himself. Which means it's going to be full of people you can't stand. And this was true from the very beginning. Think about the 12. You have Matthew, a tax collector, and you have Judas, the zealot. As one person said to me, this is kind of dated now, but he said this would be like taking Dick Cheney and Osama bin Laden and putting them in a small group together. Seriously. Matthew is a tax collector working for the pagan Romans to take money from his own people. Judas is a terrorist who believes it's legitimate to kill Romans to free his people from their oppression, and Jesus calls them both to himself. They would have never chosen to be in community together, but they were because they were both committed to Jesus. The reason the church matters isn't because you like it, but because you won't like it. Because it'll force you to brush up against people that don't think like you, vote like you, live like you, act like you, worship like you, and yet you are to call them my sister and my brother. They will be the carriers of cognitive dissonance in your life to keep you humble and open you to a vision of life with God you would never have received otherwise. So, where does that leave us? I'm concerned that, like that church in Brescia, Italy, the church in America is on a course to destruction. And now when I say the church, I don't mean the Church of Jesus Christ, comprised of women and men and children who've been redeemed by him and are living in communion with him and one another. That church is going to be just fine. The gates of hell will never prevail against it. I'm talking about the 501c3 organizations that we call churches. They're in huge trouble. But there is always hope. That church in Brescia, Italy, after its destruction, was rebuilt. It's still there to this day. It's gorgeous, beautiful marble cathedral, huge facade. At the top of the pediment, there are statues, and at the very pinnacle is a marble statue of Jesus. And around his head is a halo with radiating beams of glory. But they're not marble. They're metal. And that halo serves as a lightning rod to protect the church. Our certainty can make us stupid, but by God's grace, he can redeem even our stupidity. There is hope if we would simply be humble enough, like the blind man, and say, I don't know. But what I do know is I was blind, and now I see. Thank you.
All right, all right.
All right.
All right.
I think we should have like dad joke duel.
Dad joke. Yeah. Yes. Skye. Someone said, Skye Jethani, what's what will his talk be like? And I said, scintillating. It's just, he's going to get us going. You had me thinking, sometimes angry, sometimes excited. I felt a lot of stuff in that talk. It was really, really good. Okay, first question. You talked about, look, I don't know, right, is the beginning of all growth. And then you talked about Vim, Dallas's idea that vision before intention and then the means, that you yourself were focusing on the means, but then you said, no, the vision. But then you realized there was a step before that. Humble curiosity. How do we help people get to that place? Because I think you were saying that comes before you can cast a vision. Mm-hmm. How do we help with that?
That's a great question. I don't know. I sincerely, the best answer I have is I think they need, maybe this overlaps with the vision piece a little bit, but I think they need to see it in us. Mm. How do you make someone else humble?
Yeah.
Life kicks the crap out of you.
Right.
Right? Life makes you humble. Failure makes you humble. Realizing your certainty falls flat on its face. Raising kids is this, young adult children, this is the process, right?
Yeah.
You go ahead and try that, see how it works out.
Yeah.
But I think part of it is they also, when we model it in whatever role of influence we may have,
yeah.
and hopefully some people find that appealing and attractive.
Yeah, I think so. I also think what you said, that life beats us up. So, you know how when there's a term for it, when you get a new car and suddenly all you see are the same car,
yeah.
like that, there's a thing. I don't know what the word is, but there's an actual word. But, what? Reticular activation. Are you certain? You sounded certain. No humble curiosity. She knows it. But I mentioned that we've been doing this study for 18 months of people who've had significant transforming experiences. Here's what we've discovered. Anyone who has significant growth, it always starts with conflict and the void, a struggle. Mm. And so when you were talking, I was going, oh, boom, that makes sense. People can't move into these transforming experiences until they've hit this void, this place where they say, I can't, this isn't working. Mm-hmm. And that naturally creates the humility and the curiosity. So you've unlocked something for me.
You're welcome.
I'm going to steal it, maybe quote you. I don't know. No, I will.
I'm glad the research backs this up,
yeah.
But we could probably all circle up in groups and tell stories where we've been in that spot.
Right.
Right? Where it wasn't working for us anymore, or a awful event, tragedy, something that just shakes us out of our sense of control. Yeah. And we realize, oh, it's an illusion.
Yeah.
I don't have control. Then what do I do? Most of the people who end up coming to Jesus are people who are not under the illusion of control anymore.
Yeah.
And it's the ones who still maintain their illusion of control who refuse to come. What he says in this same chapter is, because you say you can see, you remain blind.
Yeah.
If you would admit you are blind, then you would see.
Right.
That's the whole game. That's it.
Yeah. And also what really corroborates with the research is that when you talked about what the blind men said at the end was, I don't know, but this I know. Mm-hmm. And everyone who's had a transforming experience will say, I don't really know what happened, but this happened. And then you see the evidence in their life that it happened. So there is still this mystery. So I want to just say a quick word about that word mystery, because when we talk about the theological mysteries, we're talking about things like the incarnation, the Trinity. We call them mysteries because they mean, I can't really know this fully. I can't know everything about it, but it doesn't mean I can't know anything about it. Like, I can kind of get how Jesus could be Son of God, Son of Man. I can get that God could be three in one, but it's still beyond me. Mm-hmm. It's still bigger than me. Let's talk about how you're saying, okay, it begins with I don't know, and yet as believers we also do say the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. Or we do say, credo means I believe. Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit about that. I can still say I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and Jesus Christ. I can still say that, but then also recognize the limitations of my knowledge of that? How would you?
Yeah, I think this is where our positioning in Western post-Enlightenment Christianity doesn't serve us super well.
Okay.
I think when the ancients talked about "I believe," they weren't simply articulating a intellectual assent to an idea. They were talking about, I live my life as if this were true.
Oh, okay.
It is what guides my decision-making and my actions.
Yeah.
I believe Jesus rose from the dead. I live my life as if that is the truth, and that's how you know I believe it.
Yeah.
But when I say I believe Jesus rose from the dead, are you asking me to write, a whole theological statement of evidence for that? I mean, I could research on that, but I don't think that's what's ultimately being called forth there.
Yeah.
We've separated that in the modern world, cognitive assent from behavior and actions. And I think in the ancient world, they belong together. I think a young child who lacks the cognitive ability to understand doctrine and theology can have as genuine a belief in Jesus as I do. Because that child is capable of making decisions and acting as if Jesus is real and loves him or her and wants, does that make sense?
It does.
But we've so intellectualized the faith that we actually demean, ironically, the very one Jesus put in the midst of his apostles and said, you need to be like this one. Because he wasn't talking about cognitive intellect. He was talking about trusting obedience. And that's where belief really comes into play.
I like that a lot. Because I went to Brian Zahn's prayer school, and he'll tell you that those creeds, they can be a part of our prayer because they're smarter than us. So I'm trying to live into that reality, that I'm living in a world where we can say, he was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary. I want to live in that world. I've experienced it. I'm living in that eighth-day reality I talked about earlier. So I know it, and yet I can say, I don't know it, but I'm living into this reality. Is that where you're going?
At the end of the day, what you sign your name to on a piece of paper or creed is meaningless if it doesn't come out in the way we are living. And I think the difference is you can live with that sense of conviction and the certainty with which tomorrow I am certain I'm going to wake up and continue to follow Jesus. That's a different kind of certainty than going around the culture and beating everyone who disagrees with me up with a bludgeon on social media because they don't assent to the same thing I do. That's a different kind of certainty. And that's what I think is driving young people out of the church and communicating to them that their questions and doubts and insecurities and all that are not welcomed. The person who's really, I mean, Dallas used to say this all the time, the person who's mature in their faith is impossible to offend. Yeah. And that's, I think, the humble kind of certainty of your life with God. The person, like the Pharisees, who display the most outward certainty are the most easily offended because they'll do anything to avoid cognitive dissonance to protect their illusion of certainty. So offense is evidence that your certainty is actually rooted in the wrong thing.
Okay, I'm going to have to think on that one for a while. That's a good one. Okay, I'm a stickler for getting these quotes right, and you said this, and people responded with applause, and I didn't get the last part because they started clapping. You said the sin of certainty. We engage in the sin of certainty to feel safe. And we abandon those who need...
what did I say?
Because of the sin of certainty, we're abandoning...
Those who are most vulnerable?
Yes. Yeah. Say a little bit more about that, because you got applause for that. So they got it, but I don't yet.
Well, to echo what Heather said earlier, Jesus never sacrificed others for self. He sacrificed himself for others. Is that
Wow, you listened to Heather's talk well.
I did.
Wow.
In a sense, a lot of us in the church have gotten that exactly backwards. We are willing to sacrifice those outside the church to make ourselves feel safe.
Right? Now I got it. Now, more applause.
Yeah. This is, yes, exactly.
Yes,
right.
Okay. I dig it. That is so good. All right, so the singing Quakers are going to come in.
Right.
You get to go sit down. Let's give thanks again. Skye Jethani bringing it.